Hello, welcome to Cerulean Arts Gallery. Tonight we have a virtual tour and talk for the exhibition Color of Light, guest curated by Mikel Elam and featuring the work of Peg Curtin, Bruce Garrity, Noreen Scott Garrity, Mark Green, Wanda Payne, and Marta Sanchez. So, Mikel, I'll turn it over to you.
So I am Mikel, and I was graciously asked to curate the show, and instantly I almost came up with everyone's name. It didn't take me very long to think of everyone. And the reason was I first thought about the title, and the title is called Color of Light. And the idea behind it is I've always been interested in light since I was a little kid, to the point of like looking completely into the center of the sun, looking into the center of like light bulbs, everything that was like, spotting light on objects. That was like a complete fascination to me. And then as I sort of grew into being an artist, color became the second most important thing to me. So I decided that at this point, the union between all of the artists that I chose was either a combination of color and light or one of the two. And so that's how it started. Each artist is a master at what they do, no doubt. Every single one of them, hands down, knows what they're doing. They've been doing it a long time. Uh, they're they're all different. Each one of them is different, and yet there is a dialogue between all of them, which is very interesting to see. And so I'm about diversity and about mixing cultures together. And so I thought it was important to try to choose a mixture of my reflection. And I think this group embodies that. All of these artists have been teachers at one point or another, if not for a big majority of their lives, which is really interesting because they've given back their talents to like scores and scores of young students, and I think that's also wonderful. And unfortunately, along with that, sometimes an artist doesn't get the chance to show as much as they want, because they're busy working at other things and sort of putting their lives, you know, behind. They're putting their own careers behind for other people. So I thought this was also a crucial time to sort of like, sort of spotlight that. And each one of them has been gracious enough to want to join me in this vision. And so I would like to talk a little bit about each one. So Peg Curtin, you know, I first I've known Peg a long, long time, but I don't know if I've actually really saw much of her work because I think it was like something she sort of just kept to herself. At least socially, I saw her, but I didn't know her work until there was a show that was at the Rutgers Camden Gallery of her and Noreen and a few more of their students, or I'm sorry, students, peers, classmates from when they all went to school together. And that's when I realized uh, Peg, I realized that Peg had this sort of interesting sense of color and form that I had not attached to her at all. Actually, and I think maybe I visited her once and I saw a painting that she did a long time ago, but I still didn't have a sense of like what she was doing artistically. Um, so I her form the thing that's like sort of interesting about Peg's work is the glow. there's a glow and there's a sort of this sense of color, and they sort of speak to each other. They're kind of, sometimes there's there's a form in there, but they're different colors and they sort of float on top of each other, or maybe they're slightly separated. But the use of color is incredible. And the forms are just like sort of perfectly formatted into the works itself. The only limitation with this show is that it's a smaller work show. So I know that she's worked bigger, but we couldn't include that. So anyway, that's why I chose Peg. I'm always amazed. Um, I don't like to compare artists to other artists, like meaning Peg reminds me of a certain other artist, because I think that takes away from the grandeur and the beauty of what she does. And I could easily do that with each one of them, but I don't think it's necessary because I think the work is really beautiful. Um, then there's Bruce. So I met Bruce. I've seen his work through the years, and the interesting thing about Bruce's work, for me, there's lots of interesting things about it, but one is how all of these different marks, like, make up, comprise like this bigger image, and there's layering and layering of like marks, and somehow or another, when you're looking at the work, whether it's somewhat of like a landscape or whether it's a figurative piece, all of these sort of colors and marks sort of make up this sort of like this image. And I'm really fascinated by it because every time I dive in to look closer, I see something behind it. And I'm very interested in layers personally myself. So it was a win-win. And there's a certain naturalness to it, even though some of the colors are, sometimes keyed up and sometimes not. But there's a certain naturalness to everything that he does, which I found really fascinating. Noreen. So Noreen has, she has this sort of sense of with watercolors, which is really interesting to me. It's kind of, they're beautiful and they're like dreamlike at times. At least that's what it like sort of makes me feel like I'm diving into some sort of place that she found that is somehow sort of a little bit. I think she paints from observational. I'm going to say that, but it's what she brings to it. They're kind of just these little magic gems. It makes me want to dive into, like it's something that could happen in my dream that I would want to know more about the space and about what goes on behind, um, you know, like your eye is moving around and I'll find something within it and I want to just sort of like explore that as if I was on some sort of journey myself. So that's what I think mostly about. Also, it's interesting. I the day there's feelings of daylight and sun, there's feeling of sort of moving into evening. There's also this kind of I don't know, like a feeling of like, what is the weather like at that point? Like I think about things like that. Like, is it a rainy day? Is it sort of cloudy? Is it, is there a mist? Or sometimes it's feeling of mist. And then one of the pieces I chose was the rays of light, which is that's not the title, but it's literally capturing like these beams of light, which struck me as straight out of my childlike interests. I was always following the rays of light to objects. So there's something, for lack of better words, I'm interested in a certain level of spirituality, and I think nature embodies that. And I think that that's what, also what all of these artists sort of bring to the table is just this level of like spirit and something that's a little ethereal, something that's a little like, now and at this present moment as well. So then let's see, there is Wanda. Wanda, I've known Wanda for a long, long time. We've even worked together. I skipped over Mark for the moment because I was going in alphabetical order, but I'll talk about Mark after Wanda since she's here. Uh, so Wanda is a this interesting mark making phenomena. She she's able to like sort of make these abstract images with just a lot of shape and a lot of lines, and she knows just when to stop. Like it can get to the point of like layers and layers, not dissimilar to Bruce in that there's a lot of layers, but that hers a lot of times are very abstract. It's almost like a language. She's like she's like coding. She's like sort of expressing some language that I don't understand at times, but yet it's so beautifully rendered that I want to know more. And she always allows for a certain amount of space in between all of that so that you're able to breathe. It doesn't like allow you, it doesn't suck all of the energy out of the air. There's like color everywhere. Uh the other thing is that then she's surprised me several times because you think, okay, abstraction, full on abstraction is her thing. And then she'll turn around and she will make an incredibly poignant, emotional portrait. And they're not disconnected from each other. There's a certain sense of the same coloring and mark making within the portraits. So super happy for her these days because I think she's getting a little attention and she well deserved attention. Uh, then there's Mark. So Mark, everyone here I've been friends with for a while, and so I've followed Mark through the years. And at a certain point, Mark started to make these houses, and these houses are they're they're so fascinating to me. Now he was always a really good painter, but all of a sudden the houses took on a life of their own. And I know they're made with paint and wax. So in a sense, I guess it's like, it could be called an encaustic. But the magic is that there are these incredible dreamy areas. The houses are almost like a person to me. They demand sort of investigation. Like you want to know who lives there, you want to know what happened in the house, you want to know why that house is like where it is and why it is. And then he takes color where the light would be and he sort of splashes light here and there on the images. And for lack of better words, it reminds me of like an Alfred Hitchcock film. It's just like you want to know what's going on inside. It's very mysterious and very interesting. And sometimes they evoke images of nostalgia. So that's Mark's magic. Then there's Marta. So Marta has a sort of Chicano background. And she's a very accomplished painter and printmaker, has published a book or two, and she's a teacher as well. And her work is, for many reasons, evokes images of just sort of highlighting the everyday person. She's able to capture these scenes of people working and in the streets and just doing like the typical things that no one would ever want to like really highlight as like an interesting image. And she brings like her own she works in materials like enamel paints on metal, and she works with and she's also a really good oil painter on canvas. I mean, she's done a whole series of just train yards, and these are all sort of images from where she grew up, where she's from, so they're really reflective of that. The materials she's using are really reflective of sort of her culture. And so in that there's a simplicity to some of her work, but yet they're really, really complex in a lot of ways. It's like she does all of these things to a painting only to make them look very simple. And, one would think you could easily do it, and you can't. So anyway, that's Marta. And I guess I've covered everybody, except for myself. So it's hard for me to talk about my work in this sense, because actually, as the curator, I only really wanted to be the curator part. But I included a couple works to complement, hopefully to complement everyone else's work. And within that, I was thinking about, I guess I use my imagination. So I'm not an observational painter. There were periods when I was, but I'm not anymore. So now I'm working from drawings and sometimes photographs. And sometimes I just remove myself from all of that and just work with my imagination. And so there's perfections, there are imperfections in it, but that's part of like, what I like about it is that it brings like this sort of, for me, a human element that can't really be duplicated. And each painting, as I was going to add with, especially with, I'm going to ask that question of Wanda at a certain point. I have a question specifically for you, that is in relationship to this, which I'm probably going to give you a clue right now. And that is that I allow the painting at a certain point to sort of go off on its own. So I start a painting and I have a formula for it. But then at a certain point, because I'm using a lot of like mixed media materials, I will allow the materials to take over and sort of guide me to where it wants to go. So my original idea doesn't always end up in the final. And I'm interested in spirit. I'm interested in this ideas of something I called Afrofuturism, which is about an inclusive society moving towards the future. I'm all about inclusivity, and so this is, in my world, it's like an imaginary world that we're moving towards, where there's like references to the past, but more about where we're going. So that pretty much covers all of us. And so I can now, if you like, start to ask each one of you questions. So I'm going to start with Peg. And I want to know what happens first in your work. Is it the form? Is it the color? Is it the materials? Or is it the theme? Or is it all at the same time?
It really is this. I actually kind of start with a sensation. If I start where it's just inside of me and I have to get it on the canvas. And I have developed over the years a method for a procedural minimalist methodology for getting it out of my system without completely wrecking it right off the bat. And I work intuitively. I take a lot of photographs and I work intuitively, and I work, sometimes the pieces happen very, very quickly. And sometimes, like, for instance, this one, they're not done until, as you said, the painting actually begins to guide you, the paint guides you, and you've let go of it on some level. And there's another visceral feeling coming from the work. Like I'll work on things. I've worked on a couple of things. Noreen and I talked about this for like a year or two. I put it away and I can't solve it, and I bring it back, and it's very, very clear to me all of a sudden. So that being said, I start with color. And then I think in terms of layering that color and bringing it back up or pushing it back. And then pretty much when I get to that point, I can either continue very quickly or I'm perplexed by it. This particular painting happened really quickly, but I had done, my practice is to do many small paintings of the same subject with the same composition and the same colors. And I just keep doing it until I get it right. Like some of them I trash and I'm just like, oh, okay, that's not going to work. And then finally something will happen, and it will happen very quickly, and everything's there. And I've avoided making it look overworked. It speaks quickly. So it's an intuitive process, and it very much is about color. Very, very much is about color. I'm constantly on my drives between Washington and Philadelphia, or Washington and New York. I take a lot of photos along the Chesapeake.
I was going to ask, what kind of photos do you take? Right here?
Well, I take notes. Right now, I take a lot of notes with my cell phone, but the plan is this time of year along Route 301 and the Chesapeake, it's pretty incredible because the density and the humidity is magical. It's kind of god awful on one level, but very magical on another. And it's something that I carry with me from my childhood because I grew up in that area between Washington and Rehoboth Beach. So I'm interested in exploring that more. It's been every time I go to visit that landscape in particular, I'm very, very surprised by it. So, and of course, always not only surprised by the landscape, but the water and what's going on there. So it's interesting to me. It's intuitive, and it's something that I connect to, and I hope to bring those story elements that are innate in every landscape because of who's lived there and when they've lived there, as well as your own, to the work. Is that too convoluted?
Oh, no, no, no. That was beautifully stated. I was just curious because from the viewer's angle, I see just a beautiful object. But we don't, and especially when it's much more of a sort of, I hate to use the word abstraction because there's abstraction in
clouds with a high of 72 degrees Fahrenheit
Sorry
and a low
about
of
that.
56 degrees.
There's my Alexa went off. I hate to, I believe there's abstraction and representation, and I see them as both one and the same. I don't actually separate them, but somehow to the viewer, there's always this sort of like separation of a lot of, maybe in the outside world, there's a lot of people that you're either an abstract painter or you're a representational painter, or, we recognize what your forms are, and well, those are just blocks of color. But I know that everything has origins, and it doesn't actually have to be anything. It can just be out of your mind. But in your case, when you mentioned photographs, I was just curious about where your photographs, what you were looking at,
Yeah, I'm looking at the light.
Yeah.
I'm always looking at the light, and I'm really intrigued by reflected light. And I'm very intrigued by the juxtaposition of the natural light with the juxtaposition of like a neon light with natural light. And I have actually photographed a lot of those moments where you see this just like this swath of just total neon green, and then there's the sunset. There's a kind of stress, there's a kind of anxiety in the juxtaposition of those two colors, and which leaves me feeling a little unsettled. And there's also a we're constantly going back and forth between those two worlds. So where do they meet?
Yeah, there's a certain sort of, I think it's a sort of a beautiful tension between the colors. Like they sort of are complementary, and yet they kind of are standing on their own. Like they speak to each other, but they're also sort of holding their own place. And so I find that kind of really interesting in how you sort of put those two ideals together.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So Bruce, you're up, and I guess my question to you is, what inspires your work? Now, part of it is I had this conversation with you you also have a solo show at Cerulean at the moment, and we were sort of talking about some of your imagery and where it comes from. And I thought it was really interesting. And I thought, like, I'll get you to I'll ask you about that to explain some of that when, at this, for this. And one of the things was that your work has obviously a very strong observation of like things, but then what was very curious was you told me that there were like things in there that were formulated like certain past artists have done that are kind of like, maybe it's a photograph, maybe it's from part of your memory, and you were sort of explaining that. I would like you to talk about that now, as well as the materials that you use.
Well, I mean, I think of myself as a traditional sort of artist. I mean, the kinds of images I mean, I do still lives and portraits, figures, interiors, landscapes. I mean, they're sort of, traditional subjects, and oftentimes they're they're probably most inspired by other art that I've seen. I mean, I have people come up to me all the time, and if we're out like in the landscape, and somebody says, "Oh, isn't that a beautiful landscape? Doesn't that make you want to paint it?" And I'm like, not so much, really. It's like if I, but if I go see a Courbet, now that might make me want to make a landscape painting. Or
Right.
we just got back from seeing Bonnard. I mean, I'm dying to work on this garden painting now because I was looking at this painting that I love, and it's so that's where it comes from, I think, in terms of the imagery. And and sometimes they're very close to whatever it is that I'm looking at. I mean, in the two paintings that are in The Color of Light, neither one of them is really taken from some other artist's imagery in some way. But there are some in my solo show that are, I'm looking right at a Matisse and going, all right, I'm going to recreate this Matisse. And in that, I guess I mean, by recreate, it's like if he has a bowl of flowers or whatever, a vase of flowers, and it's sitting on a table, I'll get a table and a vase of flowers and try to make it so that there's similar. There's connections between it, but no, it's not a copy of their work, and I paint it the way I paint. So I always sort of equate it to like covering songs, There's the songs, there's the chord structure, but then you can make all sorts of versions of the same song, right? And they're not all alike, or they're alike in some ways and not in others. So I mean, that's kind of where the imagery comes. There's always, I mean, when you were saying, "Oh, I don't like to say that reminds me of somebody," that's what I always do that, because I mean, my feeling is like, as far as painting goes, we're at the end of the history of painting. There's just all this other stuff in the middle. We've done the ends. We've made something as realistic and as minimal as you can make, I think. So there's all this middle now, and I don't know. I like to tell people I'm a middle of the road painter, and I think that's what, like, the most radical and dangerous thing you could do in some ways. It's like people say middle of the road, oh, it's safe. I say, you ever stood in the middle of the road?
Right. Well, there is this. I'll continue, and I'll ask this one. I'll say this one observation.
So, I mean, I was interested in what you were saying about the marks. That's the thing. It's like there's the color, but the color is all brought about through mark making of one kind or another. And the newest work has a lot of things that are fairly linear in it. There's a lot more that's drawing. Sometimes left is drawing. There's almost always a place in my paintings where you can see just the bare canvas. I seldom paint the whole thing, and never kind of the edges. I don't know, the edges are, I sort of paint out of the middle, and the edges, you can always see that it's a painting, I guess is what I'm getting at.
That's the beauty of it.
It's, there's something about the sensuality of, slimy, sort of oily color and the different ways you can put it on.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I mean, does that
I
kind of
was
answer your first question?
absolutely. I was just going to add what you think you just went ahead and said, and that was about when you stand in the middle of the road, and you know it could be a very dangerous place. And so when you're making like all of these marks, you know, you could overdo it, and then now all of a sudden you're in trouble. But there's like it's like
Oh, and it
walking a tight,
happens.
yeah.
It's one of
But
those things.
I, yeah,
Either I don't
I,
finish them, I show them, and they're kind of unfinished, and
yeah,
you know, unless somebody decides they like it and it's finished and take it away, like it'll
yeah,
go home and I'll paint on it again. And
yeah,
then others, I mean, I literally ruin because it's too far. The only way to fix this now is to paint the whole works out and start over. So, so that's
you know,
happened. And I oftentimes
you're,
paint on paintings over long periods of time. So,
yeah, you're singing my
uh,
song.
so you know,
So,
so I mean, I have a painting that I'm working on now that I started, I don't know, like 4 years ago, and you know, every once in a while I'll drag it out and I'll work on it for a while and go, I don't have a clue what to do with it now, and turn it to the wall again. And eventually they get done, or I completely wreck them, one or the other, you know, and I just
yeah,
destroy it. But yeah, it's that's really that's what's interesting about it, right? It's like
yeah,
it's you don't like to know too much about where it's going to end up. I never know what they're going to look like when they're done. And every time I go to paint, I mean, Noreen and I have this conversation. I feel like I've never done this. I don't know what I'm doing, you know. And at the same time, I do, you know. But you feel like I don't know what I'm doing. It's a weird sensation. But,
yeah, yeah. Now, Noreen, I have unless there's anything more for Bruce, I have one simple
no,
question for you, Noreen.
thanks.
Uh-oh. Okay. I'm
Um,
ready.
yeah, and it's not a hard question. I mean, maybe it is hard, but I don't think so. I think you're gonna ace this because I just wonder when you're out. I think we talked about this once, and a lot of your images that I think when I first saw some of your work, they were small, and I think you were saying you were doing a postcard size images at one point, the whole series. So
Mhm.
is it like that you go out one day and you just spot something that captures your interest and you work from there? Or do you go out and you're sort of like investigating something that really speaks to you? Or do you make it speak to you just in the actions of making the work? So,
Mm,
you know,
wow. Um, Let me see if I can break that down. So I've always been interested in, I think you picked up on some of this with the talking about the atmosphere and even the weather, which I love that. Thank you. That you get a feeling of the weather even from them. I love that. Um, so I guess the whole idea of a sense of place has always been important to me. But I used to make, and I still try to do this with real places. I used to make these kind of more fantastical, even more ethereal kinds of places, and they would often be sort of cobbled together from places that I had actually never been. And then I decided a couple of years ago, during the pandemic, I did this project where I painted a watercolor a day, and it was like 8 inches by 5 inches. And I set these parameters for myself that they all had to be, originally it was just places in Salem County and where we live. They were all going to be 8 by 5. They were all going to be watercolors. There's a little bit of mixed media in some of them. Because they needed to be very transportable. At a certain point, I went back to work, and so I had it kind of set up on my desk, and I would keep myself honest by posting them on Instagram every day. So they're all on Instagram if anybody wants to look at nearly 400 watercolors. So the funny thing is, I started with this idea of I'm going to find all these cool, interesting places in Salem County. And instead, I became fascinated with these very few places in Salem County. And including, it's interesting, I think I was telling you that two of the paintings that you selected for the show are actually three are my backyard. And the fourth one is right down the street within like a 2-minute walk. So this idea of taking these places that were very familiar, that I was seeing every day during the pandemic, boy, yes, every day. And doing something with that and still maintaining that fascination with something that you see every day. And more than that, kind of giving it like a romantic twist to make them these fantastical places. So I call the whole sort of overarching series Salem County Romantic with a big R, looking for these things in everyday life that capture my whatever, that light, like you talked about, which in the four that you picked, boy, it's really about the light and probably secondarily the color, really. Taking that moment and trying to get that moment on down. And again, they were done in a day, so they were all fairly quick, which most of the watercolors tend to be. Many layers. I'm a very layered, because I paint oil painting, I feel like my watercolors are very much like an oil painter would do. They're these almost sort of heavily over labored, perhaps. So that's kind of where it all, I don't know, I'm still not certain if I completely answered your question, but they are kind of a combination. It's interesting what you said about observation in that there are these places that I see every day, but I like to say that they're equal parts observation, memory, and imagination. So sort of taking the everyday and looking for that spark, looking for that light, looking for those rays of light or that beautiful sunset. I think two of the one with the barn with the rays was a morning shot. One of the trees is a morning. The other two are as the sun is setting. So, which would often be after I was working at home all day, what I would go out and see, either the morning or the evening sun. So yeah, they start with the light and then the color kind of comes secondarily. Did I answer your question? Gosh.
Oh, totally. You absolutely answered it. You nailed it. And one of the things I was going to say as I'm looking at the images again, these beautiful images, is that each part of your painting, you can dive into it. Like there's like sections that are just like sort of like, they're just like this really beautiful little section that you can just dive into. Like, it could be the tree, but then it's how you handle the watercolor and how it's sort of it has it has that feeling of like I said, things like, well, what is the weather like? It makes me question, what was the weather like? What was the time of the day?
I love that. The
So.
funny thing is I have, for the most part, I do even have sort of quasi records of the time of day and where it was and like photographic evidence that supports them. I don't have it at my fingertips right this moment, but I could tell you if you're curious later.
Yeah,
Exactly
that'll be a
what time of day they
conversation
were.
for us over dinner or
Yes,
something.
later.
You'll bring them. But yeah, I mean, I would be curious because I have looked at your work a lot and kind of wondered, like, those kinds of things are in my questioning. But if you didn't ever provide it, I still like the mystery of it all. So it already has, it's already got my attention. So, whether I find out what time of the day it was or whether it was going to rain that day or whatever, that's just a side note.
Well, it's a little bit like, I don't know if this is really true, but it seems like people always tell writers, write what you know. So I think it was when I started to paint what I know that comes through. It's like, yeah, there's mystery and there's things to be seen in the prosaic, in the everyday, that we're kind of missing. And just being that observational for that year was really an amazing experience. Like sort of noticing everything about my surroundings was a really, really fantastic experience.
Yeah, it's really magical, like a storybook.
Thank you.
So If there's nothing else you have to say, I'm gonna go move on to Wanda. And
No, I'm good. Thanks for including me.
okay. Oh, my, thank you for being a part of this. So Wanda, um, you know, going into, I would love to like walk into your brain sometimes and just know, like,
No, you
just, but like, where do you start on a painting would be my first question. And is it like and I'm going to ask this and you'll only really understand this. Is it like a trance-like state? Or is it like, or is it that you kind of have this idea, you know where it's going? I feel like when I'm looking at your work, that you're like channeling like people or spirits or something, because like the mark making is just sort of like this thing, like a dialect that I don't understand. Like if I was like walking through some ruin and I found some writing on a wall sometimes. But you of course have the addition of color and compositionally, you're a really good designer. Like you actually know just where to place it and how much space to leave around it, and also what colors work with what, which is part of this whole show. And you pretty much seem to know when to stop. So tell us
Yeah.
about that.
It is actually all of that. um, how do I start? Say, for instance, for example, the piece that's being shown now. I remember starting on a sheet of vellum. It's two-sided vellum. So I did a few line drawings on one side, I turned it over, did another set of line drawings on the other side, and because it's transparent or translucent, I could see through it. So I said, oh, let me start laying some color on it. And I would go back and forth, and I literally had that piece hanging on a board sitting on an easel. And every time I walked past it, I added something else. So a lot of my pieces, I let it show me what it wants to be. If I had to recreate that, which I've tried,
Mhm.
can't do it. It doesn't come out the same. Um, so yeah, it's amazing even to me. I do have a background in fine art as well
Yeah,
as commercial art.
yeah,
Excellent foundation, but
yeah.
I think you've heard this story. At a certain point in my life, I got where I just could not do anything figurative. I was just having a lot of issues going on. So I started doing lines and I started doing swirls and I started connecting them. The earlier pieces were very, they weren't communicating. They were what they were, but it wasn't a language yet. And eventually I just started with line, shadow, line, shadow, one color. Then I would add two colors, and then it progressed. But I could have never seen this coming. I had no idea that abstract was going to be my future. And it's very trance-like, unlike something figurative. Um, I was telling my mom, I said, there's some nights that I would be painting and just painting and drawing and painting and drawing. I'm sleeping. I'm nodding off as I'm working. I'm literally nodding off, but it's like, no, no. And I'll go to bed, come back the next day and say, oh my God, who painted that? It's very trance-like. And I just, so at this point in my life, I'm having fun with it. It's everything is so different. It's as if little elves come out and they do this work because I some of it I really don't remember. I mean, I don't know if that's, a mental health issue, but, some of it I just don't remember. But yeah, it just comes together. And there are times when say, for instance, this piece,
Yeah.
I had series of tissue paper, different colors. I had made sure that I had various shapes, and I normally start out with primaries and then secondaries. So I just started kind of laying things down. And then from there, without even looking, because I don't want the color or the shapes to influence me, I'll just draw something that feels right. Then I'll stop, I'll look at it and say, okay. So I treat it like a giant coloring book sometimes. And it's, it's, it just comes to life. So, and nothing is really planned. I may have ways of starting a piece, but nothing is planned. And it's always amazing
Mhm.
to me.
Mhm.
Would you also say, and I think we all share in this, I think a lot of visual artists share in this, is that, well, a lot of art forms, period, that it gets to the point that you're using your intuitive.
Yes.
So that
Yes.
takes over. You start off, you've certainly been, everyone here has been trained in their
Mhm.
craft and know what they're doing, but then at a certain point, you kind of just allow this thing that you know is there. You don't always
Mhm.
know how it's going to come out, but it's
Right.
there, and you just relinquish it
Right.
to the actual making of the work as it's happening.
Right. Right.
This isn't about me. This is really about all of you. But I wanted to add that that part where you expressed where you wake up the next morning and you're wondering who did that. I've
Exactly.
experienced that before too.
Yes. Yes.
And like
Yes.
after I go to, and sometimes I'm disappointed with what I did that day, and then I wake up the
Okay.
next day, and for some reason it looks way better than it did
Yes,
the
it
night
does.
before.
It
And I do
does.
think that there's elements like the paint has to dry, there's all these things that maybe, or your
Mhm.
eye has looked at it too long,
Mhm.
and I do think there's elements of that. But for some reason, I keep wondering, like, wait a minute, those colors are just way much more cohesive than I ever thought. Oh, the
Yeah.
form is
Yeah.
much better. But nonetheless, we share in this idea of intuition, and that is everyone's skilled enough, I think, to know at a certain point there are certain things that you just automatically know what to do, and
Mhm.
maybe there's another point. I guess in our mind, we always want to better where we were, and the next painting is going to be the masterpiece that you never made before.
Mhm.
But it's more that each painting informs the next. You learn a little bit from each one. You might learn what not to do in the next one, and you just keep going that way. And everybody's body of works, for me, expresses that.
Yeah. Peg had mentioned that she will put work away. And
Yeah,
I absolutely love digging around to see what I
Yeah.
could breathe life into.
yeah,
And, I would do it because I was taught never throw it away, never tear it up, just put it
yeah,
away. And oh my God, hidden gems. It's like now I understand
Right.
where this piece wanted to
yeah,
go. I just
yeah,
didn't have the vocabulary for it
yeah,
yet. And
yeah.
it's just like, what?
And I think emotionally, like, I know that I'm a little bit better at things when I'm not tired.
Mhm.
Or if I try to push myself when I'm tired, I generally am just too exhausted to actually, even if there's anything there, I'm generally too tired to recognize it. But with fresh eyes, with a new day, it all seems to, like, higher energy levels, all that sort of contributes to the work. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So
yeah.
that's it. Yeah. That's about
Okay.
it.
So, Michael, I guess now you could read Mark's statement.
Yes. Okay, so Mark Green wrote this statement for the exhibition. He writes, I regret that I cannot join the discussion with everyone tonight, but want to express my appreciation for the wonderful opportunity to share in this exhibition with a respected group of fellow artists, some of whom I've known for over 40 years. The title of the show could not be more descriptive of my motivation for making paintings. The subject of my art is architecturally based, but the content is quite simply color as and of light. Fundamentally, the house subjects are a pretext for painting light at a specific time of day and with a kind of air and atmosphere. The houses become geometric forms that weather these natural aspects through an open technical approach involving a trial and error process of construction, destruction, and reconstruction. I paint in oil with a cold beeswax medium of my own recipe that offers me the freedom to work wet into wet, or after fusing layers with a heating element, wet over dry passages. When a painted surface becomes inconsistent and uneven with oil wax paint mixtures, I pass a rubber squeegee over the surface to level the paint and utilize the newly smeared colors to inspire new shapes and subjects to advance the image. Eventually, shapes coalesce into recognizable forms that are architectural, the houses, and natural, such as trees and bushes. Once forms emerge, they are then refined to a satisfactory finish. Being somewhat compulsive, I will sometimes overwork a painting with excessive detail, thus destroying the more organic feel and intent I had for the image in its early stages. I've come to accept this working flaw and attempt to keep myself alert to the fact when it starts to blossom. When pushed to describe the paintings in more symbolic terms, I must admit that I often see the houses as surrogate heads or portraits that possess facial-like expressions of grief, sadness, shyness, dominance, anger, embarrassment, etc. Houses and homes are containers or vessels in which we live our lives and, in a way, represent who we are. My father trained as an architect, so there were always architectural plans laying around the house when I was a child. He designed my second childhood home, and while it was being built, he would take me to the house's construction site every night after work to see the progress that the builders made during the day. Through him, I came to understand and know various architectural styles. It is from that knowledge that I freely construct house images for my paintings, often mixing architectural styles and aspects without regard for tradition. And that is Mark's statement.
Very nice. So, in conclusion, the only thing I can do is to say I give gratitude to all of you for this experience. It was my first time actually, curating a show, and then with technology the way that it is, and with everyone living at different, and everyone working at different time periods, and living at a distance at moments, the only way I could navigate this was through sometimes with just emails and images online. But the one thing that I was sure about was that everybody at some point I had seen their work in person and had loved it, and so I was taking. For me, it was just a slight bit stressful because I wasn't sure if it was going to come together as I had envisioned that it could come together. And especially through the fact of not being able to do studio visits with everyone. But it was magical. It came together. The show is beautifully designed by Tina and Michael, and I just you know, I couldn't say more about it. It makes me want to do it again. So thank
Yeah.
you. Just so much gratitude to all of you for, you know, participating in what could have turned out to be a nightmare.
Yeah, no. Mikel, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank
Mikel.
you, thank you, all of you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mikel, and thank you to everyone for the great show. It's fantastic. We love it. And thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks,
My
Michael.
pleasure.
Great.
Thank you, Michael.
And have a great night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Bye, Peg.